What's going on, everyone? Phil here for KO Gaming. And by chance, this past week, I found some free time in my schedule to check out a game that normally I probably would have glossed over. Now, incidentally, the game ended up being so unique and different from something that I'm used to playing, and actually sparked my interest so much that I wanted to make a video about it here on KO Gaming to share my thoughts and opinions on it. Incidentally, this game is free for PS Plus subscribers in the month of July of 2016 if you have a PlayStation 4, so you may want to jump on and check it out for yourself if you're watching this video relatively close to when I release it. The game that I'm talking about is Furi, a game from an independent game studio called The Game Bakers, which is kind of funny name, and it has a unique combination of elements, being a boss rush style game with both bullet hell and melee combat mechanics, a unique art style, a really awesome soundtrack, and a lot of factors that make it absolutely unique, although I do feel the game has some shortcomings as well. So here's my impressions after playing it for several hours. Furi opens with the unnamed protagonist imprisoned in an undisclosed location. A jailer is torturing him constantly, and then somehow he gets free, runs at the jailer, and next thing you know, you've entered into the tutorial fight of the game. Now, the game has both melee and projectile style combat. By pressing square, you'll use slashes, and a combo of slashes if you repeatedly press it. If you hold square and release it, you'll do a charged melee attack that, if it connects, will lead into a combination of strikes and big damage. You also have a little hand blaster, which you can fire by holding in any direction with the right thumbstick, and by charging the right trigger and then aiming with the right thumbstick, you can use a charged projectile attack as well. The goal here is to use a combination of strikes and projectile attacks to whittle down the health of your enemy. Your enemy will actually have multiple stages of offense, and the way that you change between them is by whittling down their life bar until it's emptied. Then one of the little squares underneath their life bar will deplete, and then he'll get into the next stage of combat. You also have multiple lives, similar to the boss, where you have 3 little squares underneath your name. If at any time your health bar completely depletes, you'll lose one of those squares or extra lives, but then that phase of the boss fight, unfortunately, will restart completely from the beginning. So it's your goal to defeat all of the phases of the boss's attack before you run out of 3 lives. Now, the good news here is, if you do lose a life, but then you complete a phase of the boss's attack, you'll actually gain a life back. So it's basically an interesting take on a checkpoint system. Instead of having infinite life respawns and checkpoints at every single stage of the boss fight, you have to try to basically beat him with 3 lives that will regenerate every time that you kill one of the phases. Now, the one detriment here is that if you run out of all 3 lives and you got to the end or the final phase of the boss, you're going to have to restart all the way from the beginning of the fight. And that's kind of the gimmick and the goal of Furi at its core. You're going to try to fight these incredibly challenging and varied bosses, some of which are going to be more like bullet hell, spamming hundreds of projectiles at you while you try to dash and dodge around them. Some of them are going to be more straight up melee combat, where you're trying to dodge and parry their attacks so that you can counterattack properly, and basically get through them before you run out of your 3 lives. If you do, it could be pretty daunting and challenging to have to go back completely from the start and do it all over, especially in particular because some of these bosses have 6 phases of attack, so it can end up being a repeat of anywhere from 10 to 30 plus minutes of gameplay, especially if you had a tough time with that particular character. Your one ally in this boss rush gauntlet is a purple rabbit who you don't really understand, but he does disclose more information about his identity over the course of the game. I won't do too much to spoil here, simply because that's one of the main focuses of the game, is to unravel the story and figure out who you are, why you're imprisoned, and who all these people are that you're actually fighting. It's pretty neat as it unfolds over the course of the game. After you fight a bunch of these bosses, it's just wash, rinse, and repeat, but the good news is that the bosses are varied enough that every time you fight a new one, it does kind of feel like almost a completely new game. And similarly to that, the art style of every stage is completely different. Some of them will actually look more nature-like or outdoorsy. Some of them will look more technological, almost like a sci-fi setting. One stage looked like a sewer. So they're all unique and different, with their boss fight styles pretty much matching up with each stage. It's pretty cool. It's almost like having a really complex version of Mega Man, where every boss is really unique and different and has crazy amounts of different combat styles. Now, to be fair and to be completely transparent, the game doesn't have any other gameplay. all you're ever doing is fighting these bosses, period. There is some story and plot exposition in between the bosses, but really all you need to do is press the X button as your character will automatically walk through these stages as the plot unfolds until you hit the next boss, and then you'll initiate another fight. It is incredibly simple at its core, and it's nothing too complex. Quite honestly, if this game had traditional style checkpoints, and you could actually restart from every single phase of a boss fight, you could probably run through it in about 2 hours. A lot of the time-consuming gameplay of the game is going to be repeatedly replaying stages of boss fights to get back to that one stage that keeps hammering it in on you and that you're unable to pass until you finally figure out an effective strategy to get by it. For some people, this may feel challenging, and for others, it may feel frustrating. It's all going to depend on you and your own personal opinion. So outside of the unique artistic style and as well as the varied and challenging gameplay of Furi, one of the other things that are a strong positive is the unique soundtrack. I'm actually playing some of the music of the game in the background of this video right now, and you know what, although most of it is techno, and if that's not your thing, you probably won't like it too much, I found myself really grooving out to the tunes, especially during some of the really high action combat when a lot of stuff was going on. Having some of this bumping kind of music in the background motivated me and kept me moving, and it really makes some of these fights feel more fast-paced and exciting, so I have to say 2 thumbs up for the soundtrack selection for the game. However, the game certainly wasn't all rainbows and roses. When I played this game, I really enjoyed the first few bosses, the variety of gameplay, how they were all very different from each other, and how it basically required you to adapt your playstyle dependent on certain bosses. As I've already said, some bosses are very kind of melee style, up in your face, and you really have to learn how to parry their attacks with proper timing and or counterattack them to succeed, while other characters literally turn the game into a bullet hell, completely filling the screen with tons and tons of projectiles that you have to dodge around and or find a way to reflect back at them, and I love the variety of combat. But once you get about 5 to 6 bosses into the game, this is when it really starts to pick it up a notch, and unfortunately this is where my love for this game kind of started to sour. Now, you could directly relate this to the fact that I am not necessarily a person that loves to replay a ton of gameplay if I die in a game. Listen, I grew up as a gamer in the 1980s and 90s. I had to do this tons and tons of times for 15 years when the game developers said they couldn't fit a lot of data on a game cartridge. So we have to not have any formal checkpoints. We have to have you replay all that gameplay so that there's a difficulty spike and or enough gameplay in a game to warrant a full purchase. But it's 2016. It's not 1986 anymore, and we no longer have those limitations. So for me to play through anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes going through 5 phases of a boss, only to have 1 life left for the final phase, to have something happen that I've never seen before insta-kill me, and now having to redo that completely from the start, that's asking a lot, at least in my opinion. Now, there may be some gamers out there who love that, and they think that that's added challenge, and you need to get good at the game so that you don't have to replay it repeated amount of times. But for me, I like a game where at least if I'm learning a pattern and adapting on the fly, maybe on the 2nd or 3rd try, I can eventually get it. Now, keep in mind, there are games that I've played in the past that are incredibly difficult. I mean, I think we should bring up Dark Souls here, being one of those style of games. But the difference between Dark Souls and Furi is that Dark Souls has other gameplay in between these grueling boss fights. Yeah, there may be a tough boss that takes you 20 to 30 minutes to beat, but then you've got a span of maybe a half hour of fighting a variety of enemies, seeing new locations, and doing all kinds of different stuff outside of just fighting another grueling boss. In Furi, all you do is fight the grueling bosses, and so when you finally start to get pushed up against the wall with some of the tougher ones later on in the game, and you find yourself having to repeatedly do the same boss fight over and over and over from the start, that's when it seriously starts to test your patience as a gamer. Case in point, The 7th boss of the game, named Blast, is a sniper-style character, so for the very first half of the fight, you're chasing her constantly through this big map as she tries to snipe you. After you finally track her down, you'll fight her for a little bit, but then she'll run away again. You'll have to chase her down again. And then finally, about halfway through the phases of this boss fight, you'll narrow it down to the center area of the stage, where finally the fight will be confined and she'll stop running, but then she changes her style into a more melee-based attack. Once you get into the melee class, it actually gets a little bit easier once you learn the timing of her attacks and you figure out how to parry everything. But then you head into the final stage of the fight. Now, some people probably have beaten this on the first try. I certainly am not one of those kind of gamers. This final phase is absolutely ridiculous. It's nothing like any of the phases of the fight before it. There's these waves of balls coming at you that you have to dodge through, while there's other waves coming off the sides of the screen. At the very same time, Blast is targeting in on you and sniping you. So you basically have to dodge 3 completely different things at once in order to survive, and this lasts over a minute. It just becomes a tour de force marathon of how long can you keep your sanity while you're consciously dodging 3 completely different style of attacks at once. It's incredibly difficult. Now, the first time that I fought this boss, I made it to this stage, and I died pretty quickly. I said, okay, let me go ahead and I'm gonna give it an old college try and restart from the beginning. The second time around, I failed a little bit, but I did finally get to this final stage, and I died almost immediately again, being you only get 3 tries in order to try to beat it, and once those 3 tries are up, you have to redo the boss fight from the start. So now I started to get really frustrated, especially because the first 2 stages of this fight are you having to completely chase this boss across the map. It pads the game and makes it longer because of the style of fight that this boss particularly is. After the 3rd attempt, actually mastering the fight, I didn't even basically lose a life. I was rushing through it, destroying her, because now I fought her 3 whole times. I know all of these phases of the fight. I finally got back to the final stage with 3 full lives, and again, I was unable to survive this insane onslaught. And so finally, for 1/4 final time, I went through all of her phases again, almost perfecting them again, getting to the final stage and failing. And honestly and innately, I think this is where the huge flaw with this game exists. So ultimately, after 90 minutes of tackling this one boss, I literally had nothing to show for it. I could master all of the first 5 phases of the fight, but every single time I got to the final phase, I almost died within 60 seconds, and there was really no way for me to learn besides to continuously replay 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay that I'd already mastered over and over and over to get to this final phase of the fight and adjust. And after 90 minutes of this, I said, enough is enough, and I turned off the game for good. And sadly, I think that's what's going to happen with this style of game. And again, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of gamers out there who love this giant difficulty curve and spike, and they don't mind sitting there for hours replaying over and over in order to master the game. I'm certainly not one of those gamers, and being the fact that every boss fight in the game is going to be like this, and there's no kind of gameplay to break up the monotony of those repetitive boss fights over and over and over, this game is just not my cup of tea. I actually love the art style, I was getting into the story, I love the soundtrack, and when you actually are able to best these bosses within a few different tries, it's a lot of fun. But when you get up against the wall against a boss that's wasting 90 minutes of your time and you can master 5 out of 6 phases but fail repeatedly at the last one because it's so cheap, that's where I draw the line. And ultimately, I actually think a game like Furi could be very successful if, and only if, the game actually had a bigger budget, was able to be developed for a longer amount of time and have more features, such as, a la Dark Souls, combat between those boss stages to break up the monotony of the game. Maybe I wouldn't have minded so much going through the 5 of 6 stages over and over if I knew at least there'd be some fun, different kind of stuff coming up, but there wasn't. I knew if I really toughed it out for another hour to finally get past this final phase, I would just be fighting another grueling, challenging, and ultimately patience-testing boss, and there's only so much of that I can put up with. This game desperately cries for modern checkpoints. If this game resumed maybe halfway through the boss fight, so as not to waste 15 minutes of my time every time that I lost to the final phase, I probably would have found myself persevering and going back to complete it. But I am not going to continuously waste hours of my time just to get to a super cheap instant death style phase. It's just not worth it. And I think that's the problem ultimately with a game like this, is that I understand what they're going for. The reason that the game developers, the game bakers, made the game like this is because they knew it was a low budget game. They knew it was a game that was short and was only going to be boss fights. So let's make no checkpoints so you have to replay the game and pad it for length. But for me, that's not acceptable, and that's not legitimate gameplay. That's just padding the game for padding's sake, and leaving out a modern game mechanic like checkpoints that are a no-brainer is just absolutely frustrating. So ultimately, I find Furi to be a mixed bag. I love a lot of things about it, and I dislike one or two very particular things about it. I'm happy that I played it, and right now, as I said, being a free PS Plus game for the rest of July 2016, if you have not gotten it yet and have a PS4, I recommend you give it a download just for the hell of it to play it and see if it is your cup of tea. For me, after getting about halfway through the game, I had enough, and my patience was tested to its limits. Even being able to beat games like Dark Souls in the past, I just certainly could not get through this one, because honestly, I don't know if there would have been a payoff. You know, going through all these grueling bosses and not really seeing an open world or seeing any kind of other kind of enemies, was it really ultimately worth it to spend hours of time trying to beat one boss? Probably not. You may find yourself challenged and intrigued and hooked on this style of gameplay. And if you are, I hope that I opened your eyes to a game that maybe you might have glossed over or never heard of if you hadn't checked out this video otherwise. Alright everyone, that is it for my impressions on Furi. What did you think? Leave a comment on the video. Certainly there's a lot of people that are angry at me for rage quitting the game, which I didn't do. I simply just lost my patience and didn't want to waste more time. But I can understand when people are seeing me play a game, sometimes they get upset if I don't finish it. You can go ahead and vent your frustrations if you'd like, or let me know, do you like this style of game? Is this your particular cup of tea? And do you think that a game like this that's only boss fights can hold water in 2016? Or should it have been a little bit more elaborated like I suggested in my video? Let me know in the comments. Please also check the video description for a link to my raw gameplay of Furi over on my gameplay channel DSP Gaming, as well as many other things such as a link to a Loot Crate discount code and my Patreon. Thanks a lot for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time on KO Gaming.